Hello and welcome to today's Info Security webinar. I'm Michael Hill, Acting Editor. I'll be moderating today's session, which is in association with ThreatX. So for the next hour, we're going to be looking at how to make cybersecurity effective, practical and scalable. So just before I introduce our panel of speakers for today, I'll just run through a few quick housekeeping points on my end. There are going to be 3 poll questions in today's webinar. I'll read those out for you. So please do vote on those, and we're keen to get your thoughts on those questions. Also, there is a questions option that you can use to submit any questions you might have. You can let us know on there if a question is for a particular speaker, and we'll do our best to answer your questions later in the session. Also, for those of you on Twitter, our hashtag is InfoSecWebinar, so do feel free to join the discussion on social media as well. Just a final note about CPE credits. Now, joining this session does qualify you to 1 credit. That's based on an attendance time of 50 minutes. That's 50 minutes. Once you've done that, you can download your certificate from your InfoSecurity account and submit it. And there are further instructions on the download section of the website for doing that. Please note that it normally takes 48 hours for certificates to be processed for your credit. Okay, so let's introduce our panel of speakers for this session. There's obviously myself, Michael Hill. We have Ben Tomhave, a cybersecurity consultant, David Senf, who's founder of Cybersecurity Limited, and Jeremiah Crute, who's Chief Information Security Officer at ThreatX. So just before I hand over to our first speaker to kick off the first presentation, I'll start the voting on the first poll question for you. So first, we want to know, has your organization suffered a data breach in the last 12 months? Your options are A, yes, significant, B, yes, but not significant, C, no, D, unsure. I'm going to start the voting on that one now, so please do vote on that, and again, we'll come back to those results a bit later in the session. But moving on, delighted to introduce our first speaker today, Ben Tomhave. So Ben, over to you.
Thank you, Michael, and welcome everybody. Hope you will enjoy the next 3 to 4 hours of content. Oh, I'm sorry, it's not quite that long, but this topic is certainly large enough that we could easily go on and on and on and on. As we think about security and how it's changing, or in some cases not necessarily changing much, I can't help but apologize to REM and wonder if it's the end of the world as we know it, and yet we still feel fine. Let's talk a little bit before we get too far about security architecture, because I feel that security architecture discussions, while sometimes overly academic in nature and overly rigid, is still useful in terms of providing a good starting point and an overall framework for discussion. One framework I like to reference is OWASP's Cyber Defense Matrix, which is displayed here, and you can get access to it for free out on the OWASP website. What they've done here is they've taken the NIST Cybersecurity Framework top 5 categories and put those across the top, and then they've broken it out into devices, or what I term endpoints typically, applications, network, data, and users. This is an instructive and useful way of thinking about your security architecture and your security programs and practices to look at how you've implemented and are addressing each of these given topic areas in the rows against the different practice areas in the columns. And so, using this as a framework, I recommend as a decent starting point. You can certainly use other tools out there as well, several frameworks, but keeping it simple can be very useful, I find. So let's get into some specific practice areas overall. So as it seems to always be the case with security, we're always reinventing ourselves as any new technology, platform, or environment comes about, and certainly that's no different today. There are a number of interesting new twists on old challenges. Asset inventory and asset management continues to be a problem that plagues a lot of organizations, especially the larger the organization, the less likely it is that they have a solid understanding of their asset inventory out there. And yet a lot of what we do from a security perspective and a security management perspective hinges on being able to clearly understand our asset inventory in order to track current status on a number of items, including vulnerability scanning, remediation, patching, and things like that, configuration management as well. Another topic that we're seeing change a little bit and evolve over time is identity and access management. Over the last few years in particular, we've seen a significant movement to federated identity, which I think is highly beneficial, with the goal of reducing the number of disparate identities that we have out there in our various spheres of influence. And then the other more recent advent and really mandate is to add some degree of multi-factor authentication on top of that. And as we'll talk about a little later, some of this is changing as well and evolving to a slightly different model. But the bottom line is that we can't just do username legitimate password anymore in an AD within a corporate environment. For the most part, we have to find some way to federate our identities as well as layer in some form of multi-factor authentication. Another key area that we're all probably deathly tired of talking about, and yet is so ultimately critical to our operations and security, is vulnerability and patch management, and especially the challenge in what's called bimodal IT. So for those who are unfamiliar, bimodal IT talks about taking essentially two different IT operating models and running them simultaneously. The most common example is having part of your organization operating according to DevOps principles, much more agile in nature, versus a lot of your legacy environment, which can't move as quickly, can't be as agile, and has a lot of other limitations. So when we approach vulnerability and patch management today, we have to bring to bear a bimodal approach and bimodal thinking in order to make sure that we're applying reasonable requirements and practices. You can't expect, for example, a mainframe to be patched and rebooted within 24 hours notice unless something super critical is in place. And oftentimes you won't ever even reboot the entire mainframe, right? You're talking mostly about front-end processors. The same can be said for things like large databases. There's a reason that Oracle provides a quarterly patch cycle, and it's not because they hate security and want everybody to be vulnerable. Rather, it's because for a lot of legacy applications built around those databases, it's very difficult to actually upgrade and get those patches in place. And so to have a tempo any greater than a quarterly can introduce a significant burden to the organization. The next one up here, logging, monitoring, and digital forensics and incident response continues to be an interesting challenge. We never seem to have enough people to do that. Logging management in particular poses a number of problems, and that includes the SIM space. It's very costly, right? Everybody, I think, who is currently dealing with this problem struggles with the costs associated with the large volumes of data and how to turn it into something usable. And then the last one here is a somewhat newcomer to the space, and yet it's something that we've also talked about for a long time, which is now today termed as threat intelligence, right? And so that's a concern that we need to also bear in mind as part of our overall risk management processes. Is not only should we look at the assets in the profile, not only should we look at the vulnerabilities, but we also now need to incorporate threat intelligence to round out our overall risk picture. So again, these are some new twists on old challenges, if you will. Let's talk about three new practice areas affecting security programs today, and that will continue to affect them pretty significantly in some cases over the next few to several years. So the first one I want to talk about is DevOps. Hopefully many of you have heard of DevOps by now, but may not be super familiar with it. DevOps is fundamentally a cultural program that transforms how businesses function and operate. It is not a technical program per se, or not exclusively technical. It is not exclusively about automation. It is not just about doing agile development. There are a lot of different things that go into DevOps, but fundamentally it is actually a cultural movement that changes how your organization functions. That's very critical to understand. Now, from a security perspective, if you look at where all these gold stars are here, marking each one of these different stages, planning, building, continuous integration, deployment, operation, and continuous feedback, we have a role as security practitioners in every single one of those phases. From a planning perspective, we have a role in ensuring that security requirements are clearly understood. From a build perspective, we have a role in ensuring that secured images and pre-built tools are deployed and packaged, and all configuration management's in place. Even things like security, software composition analysis, ensuring that that's in place to monitor for and remediate outdated libraries and components. Continuous integration, similar practices, and we see in application security practices, for example, SAST and DAST, static and dynamic analysis, being introduced. Deployment, similarly ensuring that we have proper tool chains in place and proper controls, including logging of all those changes and alerting back into issue management. And then, of course, our operation environment. And the big takeaway for a lot of DevOps is not only to look at the flow, but it's the shortened feedback loops, right? One of the problems that we've historically had with InfoSec is being outside of the primary workflow for most development and even for most operations. Getting integrated within development and operations and being able to shorten feedback loops and provide timely feedback on issues that are found to drive remediation ends up being very critical and helps reduce overall costs. Moving right along, because I don't want to spend the next 3 hours talking as I threatened earlier, another key topic area that has emerged in the last few years, and is something that we're going to continue to hear a lot about, And I think, there's certainly a lot of marketing buzz around this today, the zero trust concept, but it's also important to actually look at it and understand it, because it does fundamentally change how we approach access management in general, and not just from an identity and access management perspective, but also from a network perspective as well. Zero trust is, and if you look here and read here, and I'm not going to read them to you, but you will see in the Cybersecurity that Palo Alto maintains a definition of zero trust and some of the key principles there. But it really comes together because of this concept of everything is being remote. A key challenge that is starting to affect a growing number of organizations is a significant number of your user population are not based in office spaces that you control. They are not connecting to networks that you trust. And while you certainly can force everybody to VPN into a data center and then flow out from there, it turns out that that's not very economical and causes a lot of problems, oftentimes more than it even attempts to solve. So using the Centrify graphic at the bottom to kind of simplify what's shown in the longer text at the top, Zero Trust encourages you to first verify the user, and that's again where federated identity and MFA comes into play very significantly. Then validate the device if possible. That includes a number of things such as 802.1x, local host-based policies and agents, things along those lines. And we've seen this with EDR tools, for example, coming into play to help provide additional validation and control of those endpoints. And then overall, we take that concept of least privilege, limiting access and privilege, and really maximize that principle to the extent possible. And what's interesting is if you think back to DevOps and how we work, one of the big concerns that comes out of DevOps is, developers are going to write code and push it, and then they'll be in your production environment. The reality is that no, people in general should not be in your production environment. We should be applying least privilege access strategy here and relying on automated tool chains so that developers are pushing code into repos, and then a lot of automated activities are taking over along the way with adequate checkpoints and gates along the path as well. And so that is where Zero Trust really can mesh well with DevOps and also provide you with some insights into how you approach overall strategy. And then the last one I wanted to highlight for you is a growing area, topic of interest. We've seen a certain burst of this a few years ago with containers, with Docker and Kubernetes framework for management underneath a lot of that now. Microservices. I am reminded of the Princess Bride in the declaration, inconceivable, but in this case it's uncontainable, because one of the key challenges with microservices, and for those who don't know, microservices takes your traditional monolithic application, and for every place that you would have a set of key functionality, you literally break that out into a separate small service, oftentimes running either in a container or sometimes even in a serverless environment. And so instead of having everything within a single large application, now you're running a large collection of small applications, if you will. It definitely allows you to be more agile and reduce the risk of deployments. It allows you to update individual components without necessarily impacting everything else. But at the same time, there's significant more complexity involved, and you have to have a very great awareness of impact of one service on another as you make changes and updates across the board. And what I am finding, and what I think a lot of organizations are finding, is at a minimum you have to have agile development methods in-house, and almost certainly need to be moving towards, if not actually doing and having fairly mature DevOps practices in your organization as well, in order to effectively make use of microservices architectures and really get scale from this overall. Now, the other thing I want to point out with microservices is, even though you're fracturing a large monolithic application into a lot of small pieces, this doesn't change a lot of your security requirements across the board. You still have to do good configuration management and securing configurations. You still have to ensure that your operating environments are properly secured. You still need to apply least privilege to those environments. You still must do application security testing. You still should be doing software composition analysis, and so on and so forth, right? So there's a number of things that stay the same. It just introduces new twists and challenges on how we actually do that with microservices. That said, there is also tremendous upside potential for this, and I think it will be exciting to watch how microservices kind of changes and matures over time, and how we as security practitioners are able to actually leverage this and make good use of it. So again, my name is Ben Tomhave. I have my own consulting company, and to see some of the things I'm doing. I hope you've enjoyed this content, and I will hand it back to Michael for the other two speakers to pick up the ball and run. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Ben. Really great presentation and introduction to the topic. Again, if you've got any questions for Ben there, do pop those into the question section and we'll do our best to answer those for you. But just quickly, before I start the voting on the second poll question and hand over to our second speaker, I'll run through the results of that first poll question. So we asked, has your organisation suffered a data breach in the last 12 months? 69% was the top answer, which was no, which is a very, very positive finding from that. 21% unsure, 8% said yes but not significant, and nobody said yes significant. So interesting findings there. Okay, I'm going to start the voting on the second poll question now. So next we want to know, which of the following do you consider to be the top challenge facing your security team? A, detection of advanced threats, B, lack of security staff, C, time wasted investigating false positive alerts, D, budgetary restrictions, or E, out-of-date systems and not applications. And I'm going to start the voting on that one now, so please do vote on that. But moving on, delighted to hand over to our second speaker today, David Sem. So David, over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Michael. I'm a little surprised with the findings on the poll, definitely a little bit lower than you might see in terms of the industry averages, but apparently everyone's doing a fantastic job already. They've been listening to Ben and already implementing, and I guess they haven't suffered a breach. And by the way, Ben's content was fantastic. Agree with what he's saying in terms of DevOps, Zero Trust, and really moving into a microservice environment. And when we think about that, and we think about some of the underlying technologies that are, helping to make that happen, as we think about this deeper move into cloud, we're in this period of transition with more change than I know I've seen during my career, and I've certainly been at this for a while. The most obvious one is that we're seeing this really rapid move now into cloud, and not just software as a service, but really in terms of platform as a service as well, and infrastructure as a service. So very different set of challenges, I think, that organizations are starting to look at. And what I want to do is talk about some of the solution selection that organizations are going to be doing and thinking about, and really just as we look at the challenges from an identity, the application layer vulnerability, container security, as Ben started to allude to, data loss prevention, API security. We are moving into the API economy, or whatever you want to call it, where we're stringing together, whether it's us creating the microservices or whether we're using services that we're paying for, but building those together almost like Lego blocks. And when we do that, there's a number of new challenges that come with that, which change the relevance level really of some of the traditional solutions we've been using and elevates some of the other solutions we need to start to look at. So, with so much change across an organization's attack surface, we really want to think about that relevance. And so these are 12 of the key considerations to help to ensure the right security solutions are being purchased, right? And it's going to take an investment of time to work through the cybersecurity gaps. What are the labor constraints that you have? What's the available budget, or the impending disruption? I mean, sometimes it's just going to be a small tool, but sometimes it'll be a larger footprint and disruption. How about usability for developers and for end users in particular as they get more into the mix, again, as Ben was alluding to as well. And really just the likelihood of vendor lock-in with some of these scenarios. And this precedes what you're going to be doing in terms of when you're picking your SIM, EDR, next-gen firewall, whatever that is. These are some of the things we want to do ahead of time in order to be able to then pick the right vendor, pick the right features, et cetera, right? So we want to take our time because, the vendors, certainly they've got a full-time job of selling solutions. So we need to take our time and just make sure that we're doing the right thing from a selection perspective. And, there's an investment in security protection really need to spread out farther, again, as I was saying, towards the end user. And so we really need to think about what is the usability of that solution and be conversing more with the developers. conversing more with the end users to be able to ensure that they're going to want to use that. It's not going to disrupt their work, and they'll actually not make their way around that solution. So really it's thinking about them in the context and the users of that solution. And unfortunately, we don't tend to do, as an industry, a very good job of that, which is why I'm calling it out. And it doesn't take a lot of time to involve them within the overall selection process, right? So let's take it back a step. So there's a group of organizations, and they've emerged. They're cloud-centric. They're doing the things that Ben is talking about. What they're doing is, it's great. They're moving more quickly into cloud. They're moving more quickly as an organization. But as a group, what we can see is that these organizations also are falling behind on some key security benchmarks, so around user satisfaction, around business productivity related to security, and even size of breach are areas that unfortunately they're just not doing as good a job as they could be. And again, it's because they're not putting necessarily the right technologies in place, or thinking about whose responsibility is what. So it's here, take my stuff, I'm outsourcing the apps and infrastructure to you, my security problem is yours, is part of what's happening in that context. And so we really want to think through that, and I'll get into that. So security, I guess, used to be this straightforward story of the good security pro versus the malevolent attacker, and crossing one from one side of the network to another was secured with a relatively standard toolkit, right? And on-the-job learning of this small group of knowledgeable experts. But organizations wrestle with this massive reduction in the reach of the security tools that we have today, right? And so we need to reach beyond the traditional perimeter and into new architectures, right? And so as we start to think about that, we want to think about the reach of security solutions, and we want to be able to think about how we're going to extend out. When we look at data and applications as they move out from the safety of the network into myriad clouds and endpoints and varying degrees of protection, and even just the sheer volume of data and apps and what have you is far more than we've been dealing with in the past, right? So our story certainly is getting more complicated. In this highly distributed environment, the security pro is one actor, but now on our stage as well, and with more responsibility, is the end user for sensitive data and absolutely the developer, both in terms of static, dynamic, real-time analysis tools, but also just their understanding of the adversary and who they are, and how ultimately the developer can start to protect themselves and their applications against these attackers. And once we start to really do that, then we can start to put the right solutions in place. Right? Okay, so we want to consider an organization's ability to cross this expanse from unacceptable loss to acceptable risk, right? And every organization has their own ability and unfortunately need to construct this bridge, if you will, of identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover. There is, despite what the claims are in the industry, there is no single one platform that's going to help all organizations across identify, protect, et cetera. And in fact, there won't be during any of our careers. Right? We've seen, over the last 20 years, security has been the most fragmented market in technology. And by that, I mean the amount of revenue earned by any one vendor tends to be under 10% in that market. It's not dominated by given players. And what that means is that we need to cobble together the right kinds of solutions. And when Ben started to talk about the NIST cybersecurity framework, that absolutely is the place where organizations can start, in particular with the identify component of that and really being able to identify what the risks really are. Okay, so let's come back to solution selection, right? And, the purpose of thinking about solution selection with some simple framework like this, or just the progress bars, just to reduce the latency between attack surface change and the subsequent implementation of a defense. Right, so on the one hand, we don't want to fall prey to vendor marketing, but on the other hand, we don't want to be moving too slowly. Right, so we want to progress through these phases, and often what happens is you'll see security pros or developers or end users who don't fully understand what something does, and they'll say, well, I don't really see the value in that, and the status quo persists. Right, so it's either an incident occurs or there's, they get alerted by their peers to say, this is actually really useful and helpful. Again, though, the most critical phase and the place where we really want to focus in on is that assessment phase, and becoming that assessor who looks at what it is that we need within the organization to effectively do that, right? Effectively put the right things into place. And so what I'm seeing from a budget perspective is really kind of interesting. On the one hand, we see that over 50% of data is now stored in the cloud, right? And that's even taking into consideration government, healthcare, et cetera. And yet the budget that we've got is largely still on-prem, right? About a quarter of the security budget goes towards defending what we're doing in the cloud, and the rest of it goes on to what we're traditionally doing on-prem, which shows that we're paying a lot of maintenance dollars for what we have traditionally purchased, and need to start to consider what are some of the other things that we can start to put in place as an organization, right, in order to defend ourselves as our attack surface continues to change. And so you can start to see where organizations are starting to make some of their investments. And this is kind of really interesting when we think about the delivery of on-prem security itself is starting to shift as well. And that starts to make sense, especially if I think, I'm a bank and I've got a bunch of dirty traffic coming from a remote branch, and I don't want that on my network, or I want to scrub traffic before it comes onto my main network or what have you. Then I'm going to be using an external DDoS type service for that. So anyway, just gives you a flavor for how much change that we are seeing across your peers in the market, and what are some of the things that they're thinking about when they're looking at the changes. Another area where I saw a lot of change is just how we're getting the functionality. And so increasingly what we're finding is that as organizations migrate towards the cloud, they're starting to sever some of their older relationships and looking either to born in the cloud or at least the traditional vendors who can integrate well into the cloud. And so this raises some challenges from the incumbent vendors needing really to explain how it is that they're going to help an organization extend into more of a zero trust environment, or into a DevOps environment, or just generally speaking into a cloud-based environment as well, right? So lots of change going to be coming there as well. A lot of the responsibility, though, or some of at least of the responsibility, is at the feet of the large hyperscalers themselves, and really explaining to organizations where it is that the line is drawn between what they do, what your organization does, and where that shared responsibility between the two is. We're finding that few organizations really understand where that dividing line is. And so if an incident happens, who's actually going to investigate, have the logs been collected, how am I going to analyze that, et cetera. And so it's being able to, this is more of a call to the industry itself to do a better job of explaining to end-user organizations what that balance is. But it's also incumbent on an organization who ultimately is responsible for, the privacy of PII, of, maintaining uptime and that and the like, to learn from the cloud provider as well what it is that they have to offer, albeit sometimes convoluted and difficult to determine, right? Especially as we see this increasing use of a variety of different cloud players. So what I want to do is come full circle, and Ben opened up with where I'd like to close off, which is coming back to identify, protect, detect, respond, and recover, right? And so when we talk about what solutions we're going to be putting in place, again, it does come back to the basics of simply of identifying, where are the biggest gaps that we have as an organization. What I found is that the budget that an organization has for security doesn't differentiate them that much in terms of how many breaches they suffer and how large the breach is. Right? If you have an organization with a very low security budget, sure, they're less secure. But organizations either a little bit below the average or even a lot above the average don't actually perform better than their peers. The reason is for some organizations to be more successful is that they more effectively allocate their security budget. About 80% of the security budget goes into that protect bucket today, right? Increasingly, we're seeing detect and respond grow as areas where budget is continuing to go into, and that's a really good thing. Because even in the protect bucket, what we find is the money that's being directed there isn't nearly as effective as it could be, again, because we haven't done the upfront pieces that we need to do in order to put the right solutions in place. So what I haven't done today is gone into, here are the features you should be buying in an EDR, here are the features you'd be getting in your next-gen firewall, and that kind of thing, because I think it's important that we take a step back. And by the way, that's easy to find anywhere in terms of just getting a list of the features or what have you that you should be getting. But I think, again, it's important that we take the step back. What I'm going to do is just leave this chart with you so you'll have it at the end. It's really just closing off on some points that I had. So what I wanted to do is just say, when we look to close that gap between unacceptable loss and acceptable risk, there's a 4-letter word that sits in the middle, and it's plan, right? And it's that simple. And I know we're thinking, well, yeah, it can't really be that simple. It is. It's pretty time-consuming. But I think, again, as Ben was opening up saying, the simpler you can make it, and I showed a chart earlier that just had that red, yellow, green. We want to get to things like that. And even just by doing that level of rigor, if you will, makes a big difference between organizations and the number of breaches that they suffer. So, Michael, I'll leave it there, and certainly look forward to the questions from the audience, and looking forward to Jeremiah's presentation as well.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, David. Really great presentation there. And like David said, if you've got any questions at all, do pop those into the question section. I'm just going to bring up the results of the second poll question before we start the voting on the third. So just quickly, we asked, which of the following do you consider to be the top challenge facing your security team? Top answer, 46%, was a lack of security staff. 19% apiece was detection of advanced threats and out-of-date systems or applications. 11% budgetary restrictions, and just 3% went for time wasted investigating false positive alerts. As you can see on your screen now, we're going to start the voting on the third and final poll question. So lastly, we want to know, which of the following is your biggest concern regarding information security heading into 2019? Is it A, compliance issues, B, collaboration, C, encryption, D, secure email, or E, automation? So we're going to start the voting on that one now. So please do vote on that, and we'll come back to those results again a bit later. But moving on, delighted to hand over to our third speaker today. So over to you.
How you doing? Thank you very much. So my name is Jeremiah Salisbury. I am the CISO at ThreatX. I've been doing security for quite some time. I started out in security as a child, basically doing what you might have seen in the movie War Games. It was a long time ago, but so I've been a security practitioner my entire career, from pen testing, incident response, and now to management of companies. I've had some fairly good success in reducing fraud, and taking a company that was getting compromised all the time and getting them to have zero system compromises. I looked at the poll earlier, and I think a lot of the people who answered no, maybe not even consider individual workstation system compromises as a breach, but just about anything is a breach, and people are unsure if they've been breached or not. That's probably a lot of companies out there that they're just not certain whether or not they're getting breached. So, as you just mentioned, that detect and ability to see how you're getting attacked is truly vital. The 32.7% awesomeness, you don't want to find out what the rest of the parts are because they're not as good. but I definitely have a good amount of success in my career. Let me forward it on. So we're going to be talking about the top 5 criteria for assisting tools and approach to protect our organizations. So one of the things, having been so successful in being able to take organizations from not secure to very secure, really the questions are, how do we evaluate the tools and approaches that we're going to protect? So one of the top things I've found is really thinking like a hacker. How are you going to be attacking yourself? Having that pen testing background really does help me in this area, but most companies, if you look at all the different reports, you can see the types of ways people are attacking. Web application attacks or attacking externally, still the top type of attack vector you're going to see. It's simple, it's easy for attackers to go through. It's a fairly simple methodology that they can repeat, and they've been getting lots of success. A lot of the major data breaches you're hearing is through web applications or externally facing systems. So it's still a very successful attack vector. Probably more in the news is the end user system attacks, all the phishing and malware being delivered and ransomware attacks. So that's another huge place that people are attacking. Every company is different, which is why you need to take that sort of position as a hacker to think about how you're going to get attacked, how your systems are going to get attacked, hire people to maybe help you with this. But every company is different. Your top attackers may differ, but they probably won't. And focusing on these attack vectors. So once you've identified how you're going to get attacked, protecting yourself against them. So, I talk about web application attacks. Many companies only protect one website, 2 websites, but have 10, 20, 30, thousands, tons of websites out there. If you're not protecting every single site, I will tell you that going back to thinking like a hacker, I'm always looking for those websites that you forgot about, not as important sites, things that you may not be protecting. That's where I'm going to be going. So really protecting all of your websites, all your web assets, everything that's out there. And don't even think just only your internal systems or your internally developed ones, commercial off the shelf, but also think about those third parties you may have. And companies that either have your domain name on their website providing services for you, make sure you're going after them and protecting them. And of course, defense and depth in this area is important. Secure coding, keeping your systems patched. We obviously had some recent new struts vulnerabilities come out, and hopefully everyone's patched up for that, so we don't have yet another Equifax come out. And really look for a web application firewall to help protect those assets. So another solution to go in front of your web applications to look for those attacks. That's in that prevent and detect kind of capability that we were talking about earlier. And then take a look at your endpoints, right? So endpoint attacks, truly still being attacked all the time. Look for AV that actually works. And again, with both AV and WAF, there's a lot of products out there that really aren't really doing much. If they're not protecting you, I'm not sure why you should be paying for them. So antivirus is exactly that. If you have an antivirus that's letting lots of things through and you're paying for it, you may want to look at one of the free solutions if your budget doesn't allow for that. But there's a lot of great solutions on the market that are actually doing things that can protect you. On the visibility point, EDR is a new technology for endpoint detection and response, getting a lot of great visibility into exactly what's going on in your environment, what's happening, and it can give you a great visibility into exactly how people are attacking your endpoints. And for everyone, this should be an easy one. It seems to be hard, but get rid of admin access. It's a lot easier these days than it used to be, but if people don't have administrative access, attacks are much more difficult to actually achieve on an endpoint. Truly important there. And also, as mentioned before, you need to know yourself. You need to know where people are going to attack. You're going to need to know how the assets in your environment, what they have, are they important? You need to know what are the things you need to protect. So data classification is probably the hardest thing on the planet today. Most companies aren't doing it. They hope that DLP will solve their issues, but most of the time DLP will not solve your issues if you don't do this especially. So if you don't know what your data is, where it is, what's important, or have it classified appropriately, DLP is going to fail almost every time. It's just not a perfect solution for validating and protecting your data. And I keep seeing DLP fail over and over again. It's one of those tools I like to pick on because you have to do it for compliance, but it's something that fails. But I think the real reason it fails all the time is because people don't know what kind of data they have and how to classify it appropriately. So knowing your environment, where is everything, what is everything, that goes back to the web applications. Do you know every single web application or external entry point you have? Do you know how all the different attack vectors in your environment? So really understanding exactly what you have and how people are going to attack them is truly vital. And system classification. So what are the most important systems? What are the systems that have access to the data that will cause breaches that will put you in the front pages? What are the systems that have data that's so critical that you could go out of business if you lose it? We have seen companies go out of business due to system compromises. So it's a very difficult slide to get to, but truly to do these things and know yourself will get you to a whole new level of security that will allow you to protect yourself and especially make all of your tools more effective. Without knowing what to protect and how to protect it, it's impossible to move forward. And this is a huge one. So as a CISO, I've always hated spending money on anything that doesn't actually provide the value. I don't like spending money on compliance for compliance sake only. I don't like spending money on tools that just don't do the job. I pick on AV, I pick on DLP, and traditional WAF systems have always been in this area. If it's not providing you value, if it's not either doing a very good job of detection or prevention, if it's not doing what you paid the money for, it's not worth it at all. I see this day in, day out. People say, well, we have to do this because our auditors are going to check this and validate it. But if it's not really providing a security value, if it's not actually providing a solution, there have to be other ways. And obviously, in some controls, there are compensating controls you can point to. You can say, well, we have different ways of looking at this. We may not have a traditional DLP system, but we do data classification and we do data leakage. But if it's not doing what you're paying for it to do, you need to throw it out and move on. It's pretty simple. But it's difficult sometimes to measure. And testing your tools, validating them, making sure they actually are working before you buy them, or going in with vendors where either it's very easy to do a POC to test them and validate them, or if you can't do a POC quickly, make sure you have a out clause in your contract so you can get rid of them. Don't spend too much time on a product that doesn't work. You need to understand quickly. The term always comes up is fail fast. You need to figure out if it's working quickly, and if it's not, get rid of it. And even if that causes you to lose face or have to spend more money, I'm not going to mention any names, but I bought a privileged access management tool at my last company, and it failed miserably. It was horrible. We invested a lot of time, money, resources to get it up and running, but it was not doing what it was supposed to do. It was causing major issues. And so I had to go in front of my management team and say, I'm going to get rid of this and buy a different tool. And you need to be able to stand up and say that. It's not working. It's not providing value. I am going to get rid of it, and I'm going to move on. So fairly simple idea, but difficult to truly master. But get rid of the things that don't work. And another point is when you have something and it's free thrown in by a vendor, so they say, well, we'll also throw this feature in for free if you buy this whole thing. Oftentimes that free is not truly worth it. That's not what they're good at, or it's not something that's going to be easy to maintain. It's going to have people costs. It's going to have time costs. This comes in open source software too, where you've got free open source solutions, and I absolutely love them. I'm a huge fan, but there's a cost associated with them. And so you need to make sure that if you're going with an open source solution, is it going to actually provide the value just like a commercial solution? So anytime you're giving something for free, be wary. And if you're using an open source solution for free, make sure that you understand that there's a cost associated with it as well. And then, weighing that impact versus gain. So security is always a battle somewhat of, am I impacting users? Am I impacting my customers? Are there, impacts on how we do business? And what you need to analyze is that versus a security gain. So at the end of the day, this is about making money for companies, right, and protecting them from loss. So if there isn't a security gain, enough of a security gain to impact the business, you really need to weigh that. And this is going to be, something you're going to have to go to your board when you start talking about budgets, or it's something you're going to need to be aware of is, can I give a business case justification for whatever I'm spending, right? And understand that if you start breaking things, so if you put something in and it breaks, your web application, or if it breaks your systems and suddenly everything's taking significantly longer, they're going to pull it out right away anyways, right? So that risk is there, and you need to make sure that you're not tripping over that. So, testing, validating, as I said earlier, but you need to make sure that there's a reason for this. And I'm going to hit on DLP again. When we put DLP in, there is an impact on every single system, right? You know that there's CPU hits. You know that every time somebody's accessing data or, trying to open a large file, there is going to be a major impact. And so understanding that if you're getting a benefit and a security gain out of that tool, that's great. But if you're not, is it truly worth that cost, right? Is it truly worth putting in? And that's something, it's pretty universal. I think, DLP is a great one to pick on, and I do it all the time, but it's sort of the poster child for this, because it doesn't really normally prevent data loss unless you've done a good job classifying your data. So having that go out and actually break things and cause impact to every single user you have without actually providing the value, that's just not functional. I also see it in the traditional WAF space too, where people put web application firewalls in, they put them in the blocking mode, and then the marketing team or sales team comes running down and says, hey, you're blocking real customers or users, and you need to shut this down. So it's another one that we see all the time where there can be a huge impact if they're not done correctly. And so, looking at next generation ones that have less impact is obviously a great way to go there, but it's a sort of area where you can see significant issues by putting something in place and just getting into blocking mode, and can cause issues. And then you need to look at the impacts on your team, right? When you buy a new security product to do something, how quickly is it actually going to go in? How much of your time and your people's time is it going to take to actually get in place and run? Traditional WAF and DLP, AV, all these things, there tend to be a high lift on your teams, right? So there's going to be a lot of time and effort required to get it installed, get it running, and functional. And so really the question is, can you get it up and running? Can you get it to the point where it's actually working and providing value in a quick period of time? Or do you need to estimate that into your total return on value? Like, if it's going to take you 3 months to get up and running and working, is that really worth it? And then if you're going to have an FTE or 2 or 3 or a team to run that tool only going forward, you need to factor that into the costs for that tool. And if all those are out of balance, then probably the answer to buy that tool is maybe not. So really evaluating everything against that, I think, is truly valuable. Focus on looking at tools that can go in easily, that do the job, and that are actually providing the value that they promised that they would. And I think that might be my last point on there.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Jeremy. Really great presentation there. And again, if you've got any questions there, do put those into the question section. We've got a few minutes left, so what I'm going to do now is run over the results of that third poll question to be asked which of the following is your biggest concern regarding information security heading into 2019. Top answer, 34% was evolving threats. That was followed 30% by compliance, 17% was the skills and resource gap, 13% other, and 4% budgetary issues. So a couple of tight answers there. But we are going to look to tackle a couple of the questions that we've had come in now for the last couple of minutes. Interesting couple of questions regarding obviously the topic we're talking about with regards to security products, security tools, security platforms. Keen to get some thoughts from the panelists on where they see at the moment the situation with regards to, I guess it gets referred to a lot of snake oil, but how about the kind of misinformation and buzzword terms that are around security products? Ben, do you want to share a couple of thoughts on that and where you see that at the moment?
Yeah, I think, and this goes really part and parcel to your security architecture approach too, right? That anytime you're looking for a solution, you need to, A, first understand the problem, B, establish good criteria by which you can measure prospective tools that you're going to implement to address that problem, and then through your POC process and other forms of testing, make sure it meets it. Because there are a lot of marketing hype, a lot of overpromise on overall. We hear a lot about AI and ML and cloud and microservices and so on and so on and so on these days. And yet when you peel the layers back on a lot of these things, you find that it's greatly oversold or grossly ineffective. And we see this a lot with IDS and AV in particular. Anything that's signature-based has a hard time pivoting and adapting and really truly meeting a lot of needs. So I think there's a lot of challenges that can and should be addressed through the acquisition and solutioning process.
Yeah, you got to figure AI and ML is the biggest snake oil that's out there today. I mean, certainly it can add value to what Tier 1 analyst is doing or to what any tool is going to be bringing to bear, but way overstated in terms of, in fact, we're seeing vendors, calling it the immune system and all kinds of things that would indicate that it's complete and that it's got you fully protected and what have you. Really, we've been in the industry dealing with statistical analysis for a long time. Adding in, random forest or neural nets or what have you, sure, it's great, and it adds another layer of analytic capability, but it's probably the area I'd say is the most overstated in our industry today.
And David,
yeah, I totally agree on that. I mean, AI and ML, I think that's probably the biggest things I see out there. And most of it's statistical analysis, and if that's a solution that works and is providing value, that's great. Call it statistical analysis, call it futuristic or advanced statistical analysis. Maybe it's k-mean clustering. Maybe you're doing something advanced in there. Really, a lot of that is actually extremely effective. Looking at all your data and seeing what stands out, that can be a very valuable tool. It's not AI, it's not machine learning, but it's a great tool to find interesting things in your data and call it as such. So don't, if you do have vendors saying they're using AI, really sit down and talk to them about it. And most of the time, it's just going to be some advanced statistics.
Sure, and great. David, just get your thoughts on a quick question here. Just from what you've seen before, just how often do you think companies purchase a solution or a platform thinking it's one thing and it turns out to be something that isn't right? How often do you think that happens?
Oh, there's this huge promise gap in the marketplace between what I thought I was buying and then what I actually got at the end of the day, and how helpful it was. There's a few different reasons for that. I think Ben articulated it again really well in terms of understanding the problem set, knowing what the criteria are, et cetera, and then really knowing how and who it's going to help. So sometimes it's the organization's fault. There was a disconnect between the buyer and the user, and that disconnect was too great, and so that's what caused the problem. Sometimes they were simply oversold. It was a great steak dinner and et cetera, and they bought into the idea and wound up with a solution that didn't quite fit. Other times the solution was operating as intended, but in that given client's environment, the footprint for them is just way too big. And SIM for a lot of folk wound up being one of those things that for some organizations, incredibly awesome. They actually have the analysts who can filter out false positives, and they can work with it, they can get all the feeds in, they can analyze all the data they've got. It's great. While for other organizations, not so much. You want it being very expensive, and their challenges with it were just too big for the labor supply that they had within their organization. So it wasn't really a vendor problem, but it was the organization's problem.
Sure, and Jeremiah, let's come to you for a final question before we look to wrap up. Let's get your advice on how important is it to kind of to build that, I guess, CISO vendor relationship, and what's your advice for doing that, having been in that position yourself in the past and now?
I would say keeping your vendors honest and being open and clear with them. I mean, really, you need to understand which ones are selling that snake oil and which ones aren't, and be very clear, like setting boundaries, saying if this doesn't do X in 3 months, we're going to kick you out, or this is exactly what we need to do for a POC to get it up and running and test it. You need to be clear. You need to just assume that every vendor is lying, even me, and test it out, validate it for yourself. So establishing those good relationships that are direct, honest, and clear, I think is valuable, and setting it in your contract. So you have a get-out-of-jail-free card in a contract with something that you're going to try. If you can't POC it quickly and well, get that get-out-of-jail card for sure. So setting that up, I think, is truly important. But vendors, be clear with them, hold them to task, and, if they say AI, you probably should walk out.
Sure, great. Okay, well, fantastic. Looking at the time, we've only got a couple of minutes left, so we are going to have to look to wrap things up now. So a big thank you to ThreatX for their sponsorship of this session, and of course a big thank you as well to Ben, David, and Jeremiah for joining us and for sharing your presentations. Hope you all enjoyed those as much as I did. They were fantastic. For details on upcoming sessions, please check out our website. Our next session is actually going to be on the 15th of November, and we're going to be looking at advanced holistic data protection and centralized key management and how that applies to multi-cloud. So we hope you can join us for that one if you can. Please don't forget there will be a recording of this session available on the website soon. You can also rate the session. You can tell us what you liked and what you didn't. So please do that if you can. Without further ado, I will thank you all for joining us today, and we will end the session there.